thank you all for coming along. It's lovely to see so many folk interested in the Scottish witchcraft trials. So over the next hour, I am going to try and shine a light onto what is a vast, complex, often confusing, but always fascinating subject. So in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, the enemies of God were sought throughout Europe amongst young and old, rich and poor, men and women. People watched out for signs of witchcraft amongst their neighbours, their friends and their families, while an accusation of witchcraft could spread fear faster than an outbreak of smallpox. In Scotland, the church was particularly diligent in this. The Bible was clear. Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And in 1563, the Witchcraft Act became law, making witchcraft a capital offence, so you could be executed for this. Why, I hear you ask?
Why?
Why? Why 1563? You know, the concept of witches had been around for thousands of years, so, you know, why not 100 years earlier, 100 years later? Why introduce a law at that point? To try and unpick some of this great complexity of what was going on, we have to go, now you have to use your imagination here, we're going to go to the continent, right? Now this is the continent, and we're going to go back 100 years, 15th century, and several authorities during that century began to convince themselves, when they were interrogating people for heresy, that there were secret sects meeting, gathering together to worship the devil, to meet with the devil, worship the devil. And when you interrogate people under torture, it's surprising how quickly you do get the evidence that you want to hear. There was a big change in attitude as well in that century. There was a change in thought that a witch had no power of their own. They only had power because they had entered into a pact with the devil. Now that was a really important mindset change that happened in that century. So we're going to go over here, because over here, this is Scotland, over here, right? Scotland, the continent, Scotland. 1560, we've got the Reformation. Scotland's basically changing from a Catholic country to a Protestant one. And Protestant ministers were very keen to show that they were more godly than their Catholic counterparts. Over here we had various areas of counter-Reformation where Catholic priests were doing the same thing, but the church and the state did work very closely together at that time. And there was a desire to create a godly state throughout the whole of Scotland. And one way of showing you were doing this work was to find witches. I'll come back to the continent over here. The first European witch hunts were in 1427, and that was in Savoy in the Western Alps. And the last execution for witchcraft was in 1782 in the Swiss canton of Glarus. Now, during that sort of 350 years, throughout the whole of the continent, England, Scotland, around 50 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. So it's not millions, as you sometimes hear this quote, or millions of people were executed for witchcraft. No, there's a lot of academics that have been studying this for the last 20, 30 years, and they've all pretty much agreed on this 50 to 60,000. Well, I mean, that's a horrendous figure, and that's a terrible figure to think that all those people have been executed. And during that time, that 350 years, all four major Christian denominations, so Roman Catholic, Calvinist, Lutheran and Anglican, they all persecuted witches to some degree. Scotland, 1590, quite early still in the witchcraft trials, and the concept of witch hunting gets the royal seal of approval, because King James VI, what happened was he went off to Denmark to get a bride, to get his bride. It was arranged, he didn't just turn up, looking for something, So anyway, he went to get his bride to be Anne. But when they tried to get back, there were great storms that prevented the ship getting back for ages and ages and ages. And he convinced himself that these storms were created by witches. And eventually he gets back. and you have this bizarre situation where you've got the King of Scotland actually interviewing people face to face, individuals who are thought to be witches. And this is the Great North Berwick witch trials, of which many people were executed. But he sort of gives, this fascination or almost obsession he had, gives a royal seal of approval to the whole concept. And in fact, he, in 1597, he wrote what was actually quite an academic book at the time, called Demonology. And this was the king's opinions on demons and witches and how to find them and what to do with them. So, I mean, it really did get that royal seal of approval. But we're staying with Scotland, over this side, right? But we're going to go back, 1563, the Witchcraft Act, I keep saying this the wrong way around, the Witchcraft Act comes into force, making witchcraft a capital offence and also associating with a witch. So you could be executed just for actually having gone to somebody for whatever, advice or whatever, who then decided that they're a witch. So it was a very severe law. And it was on the statute books until 1736. And during that time, it was reckoned that around 4,000 people were accused of witchcraft in Scotland. Now that's where there's an actual record. So if two people have an argument and one says, oh, you're a witch, you are, well, that's no record of that. But this is where someone's made an accusation that's actually been written down for some reason. There's been an official within hearing and it's written down. And of that 4,000, around 2,500 people were thought to have been executed while that law was on the statute books. And this is just Scotland we're talking about. Now, by head of population, you are 5 times more likely to be accused or executed in Scotland for witchcraft than you were in England or the whole of Europe, apart from the states or the areas that we now know as Germany, which obviously didn't exist then, but these states that make up Germany today, they were very vigilant, if that's the word. But in Scotland, we were 5 times more likely. I want to look at some myths, modern myths that people have during the next, 50 minutes, what's left of them. And people often think, oh, it was the midwives that they were after. It was the midwives. Well, when you look back at the records, and the records are often missing, they're often poorly written, and they're often written in a way you have to read between the lines. But midwives were no more targeted than any other profession. And people often say, oh, it was the alewives, the brewers of ale, that were targeted. Well, some of them would have been brewers of ale, but no more than any other profession that they weren't targeted anymore. People say, oh, it was the old women in the village that were past childbearing age, they weren't of use anymore, so they called them witches. Where the married status of a woman is given, who has been accused of witchcraft, 78% were married. So, there's a lot of sort of theories or myths that have grown up over the many decades. But there was one group that was targeted, and it's hard to argue against this, and you probably know this, it was women. Women were targeted, and of the accusations and the executions, around 85% were women, 15% men. And what's sort of fascinating, if you like, that's the right word, that's a very, very similar figure to the rest of Europe. 85% women, 15% men. There were some differences. Estonia, Finland, Russia, it was roughly 50-50 men, women. In Iceland, 90% of the people executed for witchcraft were men. What I'm talking to you here this afternoon, and this whole subject, if I can do that, this whole subject, none of it's black and white. It's massively complex. It's often contradictory. Even the academics don't always agree on the significance of different things that were happening at that time. But on the whole, it was 85% women. So why women? Why women? You could probably spend weeks debating this point. But in very basic terms, men were in power, and men just thought that women were weaker in body and spirit and mind, and so they were obviously much more susceptible to doing the devil's will and his evil. And of course, the male way of thinking was that they were all desperate to sleep with the devil. He was always portrayed as being male, so no hint of misogyny in any of that. So why was anybody accused? To get down to the absolute basics, why was anyone accused? You know, what were they doing to end up eventually in a court? There's absolutely no evidence that there were secret pagan worshippers. I mean, this is another theory that's come up, but there's no evidence for that. They would almost certainly have been Christians. They would have attended the kirk on a Sunday, and they would have tried to live their lives to the high standards set at that time. I think it's rare, it may have happened, but it wasn't the case that, you know, somebody wanted someone else's land or their cow or their silver or whatever, and so they called them a witch. It was actually quite a dangerous thing to call someone a witch, because if they weren't actually found guilty in a court of law, they would sue you. So it was a dangerous thing to do. You didn't just do it. What was going on is that, and you know, we have to get our minds back 300 or 400 years, that old Nick, the Black Douglas, old Cleety, whatever you want to call the devil, he was real, and he was out to get you, and he didn't want evil people. You already had the evil people. You wanted the good people, the righteous people, and people really did fear the devil, and they feared witches who were considered to be his handmaidens. Now, as I was saying a few minutes ago, nothing is black and white. Someone could have a reputation for decades as a witch and live in the village and nobody does anything about it. You know, they maybe don't upset them. You don't want to upset somebody that you think is a witch. But nothing happens, and it may not be until there's some incident that then brings it to the attention of the authorities. But, you know, they could live there for decades with that reputation. The most common reason for an accusation to start bubbling up was no more than an argument. And so if two neighbours have an argument, and then a couple of days later the other person's cow stops giving any milk or less milk, there's something we have to really appreciate here, is that people then, they believed that nothing bad happened unless it was someone's fault. It had to be someone's fault. So whether it's the king, he doesn't think it's a weather pattern, there's a storm. He thinks it's witches. The neighbour, he doesn't think the cow's not got the right grass. I don't know why cows don't get milk. Whatever, he thinks it's been bewitched. And that's really important, that people did believe that it had to be someone's fault. But what would generally happen would be that they'd come and try and make up. You didn't actually want to be on the wrong side of someone you thought might be a witch. So they'd come and try and make up, and they'd say, oh, well, sorry, we had that argument, you know, and can we make up, and, you know, don't want to fall out, and by the way, my cow's not very well. You know, so often it didn't actually go any further, but it started, that memories were long, and it started, you know, someone's hen stopped laying, and this could all come back to haunt somebody. Now, you may be wondering, or maybe you're not wondering, why it is I've spent the last 4 years totally immersed in researching the Scottish witchcraft trials. And those that know you will know I'm a writer, and I've written an historical fiction inspired by the case of Janet Horne. Now, some of you will know the story, but I'll quickly tell you. Janet Horne was the last person in Britain to be executed for witchcraft. And what happened, it was 1727, and Janet and her daughter, we don't know the daughter's name, I call her Ayla in the novel, and they were living north of Dornoch, and they were arrested, charged with witchcraft, held in the Dornoch toll booth. And Janet is thought to have had the beginnings of dementia, and Ayla, call her Ayla, was thought to have had a deformity of some description of her hands and feet. And one of the rumours was that Janet had turned Ayla into a pony to ride around and do the devil's work, and the devil himself had shot her feet, hence these deformities. So it is an extraordinary story. What actually happened, it goes to court in Dornoch. The court almost certainly did not have the authority to try such a serious case, but never mind, they did, and they were both found guilty and both sentenced to be executed the next day. And the daughter, Ayla, she escaped from the toll booth that night and went on to at least have one son, so she got away and had a family. Janet, of course, was executed, and there's a stone in Dornoch that it marks the site, or is said to mark the site of the execution. It's there, you can see it. So, writers, you know, I don't know if there's any, well, there are writers here, I know there are writers amongst you, but we love to talk about story arcs. You see, that's a story arc. And to me, this story, it's a bit like the Titanic. You know, at the end of the book, that the ship's going to sink. You know at the end of the book, Janet is going to get executed. That's a historical fact. But it's that journey that just grabs you and it brings you back again and again and again. And that's what I feel about this Janet Horn story. And it's a tragedy, but it's also a book of love and loyalty and sacrifice. And that, surprisingly, perhaps there's a lot of humour in there. The protagonist is the daughter, Ayla, and she's an unusual, it's written in the first person. It's her view of what's going on. And she's maybe an unusual protagonist in that she's beautiful, she's disfigured, she's very disabled, she's highly intelligent, and she's dangerously outspoken. Of all the characters I've ever written about, or created ever in any of the books, I am the most fondest of Ayla. The writers here will know exactly what I mean, but this one character, I am the most fondest of this character. And I think we should have a little reading. It is a little reading, and it is relevant to what was going on. Are you all hearing me okay? You're all very quiet.
When is the book coming out?
April. Yeah, no, April.
April,
yeah.
Yeah.
I will come back to the book information, but thank you, John. Yeah. Right, I need some different glasses. I'm just going to read you this little scene. Now, there's a temporary minister who turns up in the Loth area where Janet and her daughter live, and something has happened in this. They've gone to this Sunday service, and it's the first one with a temporary minister. And something's happened, and Janet and Neil are desperately trying not to laugh, and so they're sitting in the pew. I'm not going to tell you what's happened, but I'm just going to read on from that point. This torment continued for many agonizing minutes, as lining out was tedious beyond belief. But any human in the situation died when the temporary minister walked into view and slowly climbed the stairs. His appearance had a powerful and immediate effect, with many voices simply trailing away to nothing. It wasn't his clothes, for they were similar to most Presbyterian ministers, black breeches and leggings on top of black shoes and with a long black gown. The only white items were his cravat and preaching tabs. Nor could you really say it was his physique, even though his extreme thinness was the opposite of what we were used to. Rather, the huge impact came from an aura of hostility, which made me think, although I don't know why, of a reptile. When he stepped into the pulpit, the minister looked down upon us with an expression that seemed angry. There was a rigid format to a Sunday service, and when the song was over, we all stood for the first prayer, men removing their bonnets if they hadn't already done so. The prayer normally formed a significant part of the morning, but it was surprisingly brief. As we sat and Reverend MacNeil stared upon us, I felt a strange unease creep over me. He gently laid down the Bible in his hand. As expected, he had no papers. Ministers who relied on notes were viewed with suspicion. Evil walks among you. It works beside you in the field. It eats at your table and sleeps in your bed. Yes, look around. Examine closely those sitting nearby, because evil can enter even the house of God. Mother and I glanced at each other. This was not the type of sermon we were used to. Heads turned this way and that, people looking at family, friends and neighbours as if expecting to see someone different to the person who had sat there every Sunday, month after month. I wondered if the minister was leading up to an attack on the Catholic faith, or perhaps those who secretly held Jacobite sympathies. The last Jacobite rising had occurred only 8 years earlier. I couldn't have been more wrong. Witches! There are witches among you! This caused a huge stir, with murmured comments flowing throughout the kirk. It was a sign of how shocked people were that they made any noise at all, as speaking during a service was severely frowned upon. The minister waited patiently before continuing. You think that Reverend MacDonald has had to leave because his sister is sick. I say to you, no. He is gone because it is God's will that I should come here and root out the evil that has been left to spread like the pox. Remember the words of Peter. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. No one felt comfortable at such talk of witches, while many feared mentioning smallpox so openly would tempt yet another wave of cases. The country had been battered by the disease as if it was an unstoppable tide coming back again and again. Within only a few minutes, the minister had created significant unrest. Mother tapped my thigh and I leant in, stepped slightly towards her. Sowing mistrust is a dangerous seed to plant. It's a crop that can so easily lead to violence. There was enough noise for there to be no risk of a whispered comment being overheard. I straightened up as people quieted down again. I tell you that in doing God's good work, I have come across women who have renounced their God-given baptism, who have stood with a hand on the crown of their head and another on the sole of their foot and offered everything in between to the devil. He paused, scanning the faces below as if seeking out a guilty expression. Many of the congregation found something of interest at their feet. The minister could certainly play an audience, his dark eyes blazing with such passion and zeal to do God's work. Then they alighted on me, and I felt a physical jolt throughout my body that left me unable to break his gaze, as if he was indeed hypnotizing its prey before striking. I have seen women who have willingly given their naked bodies to the devil in vile lust and depravity. I have seen the marks on women who have let the devil's imps feed at their breast. Mother gently laid a hand on one of mine, breaking the spell by her touch. She gave me a tiny nod of reassurance. After that, I didn't let myself be controlled again, regardless how much the minister focused his attentions on me. When we finally emerged from the kirk, I thought that the fresh air had never felt so welcome. A breeze was blowing in from the sea and it carried a salty tang of seaweed from the nearby shore. Mother and I moved away from the rest of the congregation, who were babbling as noisily as excited children. I didn't like his apparent interest in me. No, agreed Mother, that was unfortunate. For some reason I can't explain, there's something about this man that scares me. I know what you mean. He'll believe he's doing God's work when some poor soul's body is burning at the stake. Some poor woman, I added. Yes, I've come across this type of zealot before, though not for many years. He'll seek out witches amongst women because he hates them. Perhaps not in the way you mean. The words of John Knox in his life continue to echo down the generations. I suspect he hates what he sees as the enemies of God and thinks he is more likely to find them amongst women. Seek and you shall find. Well, he needn't go searching in our direction. And of course, that's exactly what this minister does. He becomes obsessed with trying to prove that Janet and Ayla are witches. Right, we're going to leave that aside. Right. Okay. The rumours have bubbled up and they've reached the minister and the kirk elders. And what would generally happen is the person would be brought before Kirk session, and this was a serious thing for someone to be brought before Kirk session. But often it would go no further. The minister might just say, look, this is just silly nonsense, stop, superstition, get back to work, stop, this is just silly. But if they did think someone was a witch, or potentially they really could be a witch, then they could be held against their will, and they would invariably be subject to something called watching. Now, we're looking back hundreds of years, and they thought they were doing good work. It wasn't that there was anything devious about any of this, but we understand differently today what watching is, and I'll explain it to you. It would be Kirk elders working in pairs and working in shifts, and they would keep the person awake day, night, and not allow them a minute's sleep. And after that, we understand about sleep deprivation, and people were just like gibbering idiots that just agree to anything. I'll just talk briefly about torture generally, not the Kirk here, but the secular authorities. It was used, and it was, I think it got a little bit out of hand at times, certainly when any of it was out of hand. The Privy Council in Edinburgh, I think it was in the 1660s, issued a law, whatever, saying that no one should be tortured without their permission, without permission from the Privy Council, but it still went on in places, just underneath the radar, if you like. And people would be asked questions that we understand now would be leading questions, but they didn't think they were at the time. So they wouldn't say things like, did you meet the devil? They would say things like, when you met the devil, was he cooled? Because the devil was thought to be cooled to the touch, because the devil had no blood, he was always considered cooled. And however the person was being tortured, eventually most people, they just say, yeah, when I met the devil, he was cooled. Now what would go down in the records was the confession. Confessed when they met the devil, he was cooled. How they got the confession wouldn't be written up normally. And again, it's not for any devious reason. It was immaterial to them. The confession was the thing, was the confession. How they got it was irrelevant. And with the confession, obviously, you can have a criminal court case. Right. There were 4 areas of proof, as they thought, of witchcraft. One was to be just quarrelsome. It was very dangerous for a woman to be thought quarrelsome, and that could lead then to accusations of witchcraft. Confession, that was very dangerous, and cases where people were executed by the criminal courts. They were executed on no more evidence than the confession they'd given under torture. Now, there must have been something earlier on to make people suspicious of them, but even if they recanted it at the court, because by the time it gets to court, they're probably not being tortured. And sometimes what happens, people say, well, no, I'm not a witch, I only said that because I was being tortured. But they could still then often be executed. To be accused by another witch, now this was very dangerous. And what generally happened was that, I'll say women because it nearly always was women, they would be questioned. The authorities, whichever authorities it might be, they would always say, right, when you met the devil, who else was there? They couldn't believe that if there was one witch on their parish, there had to be more witches. Who else was there? Tell us their names. And women would generally then name other women, because that's who they knew. And eventually they'd just be saying, yeah, Margaret was there, Agnes was there, and And then those women would be arrested and brought in and tortured under no other evidence than the poor woman who's just said names to stop them torturing her. And that's when you get these, sometimes they're called witch panics, but that's not quite correct, because to the authorities, they weren't panics at all. They were logical, they were ordered, there was a legal process, and they weren't panicking. Everything made sense, and people today look back and go, oh, there were witch panics, because hundreds of people were getting drawn in, and it would normally last about a year or two, and they just burn out. They just die and stop. The fourth area of proof there, that is the devil's mark, and I'll come back to that in a wee while. Now, I want to talk to you about the swimming test, because a lot of people have probably heard something about all of this. And the swimming test, the thinking behind this was that water was a pure substance. So think of wishing wells and rivers where magic things happen. And when a witch meets the devil, they renounce their Christian baptism, and so if you take them to water and you throw them in, the water will repel them, because the water's pure and they're evil, and they'll float. So if they float, they're a witch. What would actually happen is that the accused person would be taken to a loch or river somewhere, and a thumb, like that, a thumb, would be tied to the big toe of the foot opposite, and the other thumb would be tied to the big toe of the other foot, and then they'd be thrown in. And people think, oh well, yeah, if they floated, they were guilty, they were a witch, and if they sank, they were innocent, and they drowned, which is a bit harsh. That's not. Yeah, that's not what would happen though. That's a misconception. The people in the 17th century, they weren't stupid. They were as intelligent as we are. They had different beliefs, but they knew if somebody sank, they were going to drown, and they were the innocent people, and that would be a terrible thing to do. So when the accused person was thrown into the water, they always had a rope tied around them, probably just around their waist. So if they sank, they were pulled out. You know, they weren't allowed to drown. That would be an awful thing. People would be murdering innocent people. They were pulled out, and they were rescued. Maybe sometimes accidents happened. People did drown, but that's not what was going on. They were pulled out. They were considered innocent. Off they go, back to there. Now, this is the swimming test I'm talking about. It was used a few times in Scotland in the 1590s, so early on in the witchcraft trials. It seems to have been discredited at that point, and there's no evidence of it ever being used again in Scotland. So this whole concept of the swimming test in Scotland, no, it didn't happen. A few times, very early on, and there's then no evidence of it ever used again. Different in England, and what was happening on the continent was different again, but in Scotland, no. Now, it says here, so it must be right, it says audience participation. Yeah, that's good. Right, shout out please, what image do you have of a witch? Anything, clothing, age, money, anything?
A pointy hat.
Pointy hat, thank you sir. Broomstick, thank you, yes, very useful for sweeping the floor and flying to the devil, yeah.
Cauldron.
A familiar, thank you,
Cauldron.
yes. Cauldron, maybe, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right, so, yes, I've no idea why witches are meant to have a big nose. That's beyond me, I have to say. But if somebody walked in the library now, and they were dressed in rags, and pointy hat, broomstick, black cat, and a false big nose and a wart, don't forget the wart, we would all of us know that they were meant to be pretending to be a witch. We just know it. And yet, why? It's complete nonsense in terms of what we're talking about, the witchcraft trials, 1563 to 1736. Such an image would be just unimaginable to people. Someone considered witch would look exactly like everybody else, certainly be dressed the same, and they would just look like anybody else. So, we've all got it. So where's all this, pointy hat, broomstick stuff come from? Well, I'm going to tell you, because it's quite interesting.
Disney. Walt Disney.
Not quite so simple, but yes, thank you, yes. The answer there was Walt Disney, in case anybody missed it, but no. Right, pointy hat. Mid-18th century in England, the witchcraft trials are already over, law's been changed. Cartoonists who wanted to portray someone as being foolish, or they wanted to belittle someone. Now, you go around the corner, you buy a newspaper, and you can see it today, you know, cartoonists are wanting to make a politician look foolish, do a little caricature, make them look foolish. That's what was happening in the mid-18th century. And what they would do, they would try and imply that this person believed in witchcraft, because by then that was considered a very old-fashioned belief. You know, it was the age of enlightenment. People were looking to science. And they would draw them with a pointy hat, because by that era, mid-18th century, that was a very, very old-fashioned item of clothing. So they'd draw them with a pointy hat, and they'd whatever, and make out that they believed in witchcraft, and obviously they were completely out of date. So that's what stuck, but it's got corrupted over the years so that people think that witches wore the pointy hat. But that's where that came from. Somebody said broomstick, that's quite interesting. Witches were thought to fly to the Sabbath to meet the devil. And some people thought that they just flew. Others thought that, in Germany, they thought they used like a big pitchfork, and they flew on this big pitchfork. And you can see drawings from hundreds of years ago, which is particularly in Germany, and they all got their big pitchforks and all flying off to meet the devil. Some people thought they flew on an animal, like a goat. Then you often see drawings of hundreds of years ago, and they're following, why a goat? I've no idea, but they've got the goat and they're flying off. But in France, they thought it was a broomstick. And the earliest drawing is in the 15th century of this witch flying off to meet the devil, and she's got a broomstick, and that was French. But, you know, none of this would ever have been in the witchcraft trials in Scotland that we're talking about. You know, the idea of saying, oh, that's some evidence against that person being a witch because you've got besom. Well, everybody had a besom. It would just be nonsense. But it stuck. The French concept of the broomstick, that stuck, and we've all got it. We've all got that idea. Now the cat's interesting, because the cat was English. Somebody said familiar. So the witches were thought to have a familiar, and that would be a small animal. In England they thought it was a cat, it could be an owl, it could be a toad, it could be, but it was a small animal, and there are different sort of theories, but basically a familiar was a demon, or it's a spirit, evil spirit, or something like that. And in England they thought it was a black cat, and that's the image that stuck. I don't know why, but that, you know, we've all got this, and you can see drawings from hundreds of years ago, and they've got great big noses, and you think, oh, why? Why they have to have a big nose? I don't know, but that goes back hundreds of years, that concept. And we've all got it, haven't we? It's all come into our minds, but in the era that we're talking about, none of that would have been, in anyone's mind.
Could the big nose been anti-Semitism?
Maybe, yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the point was, the big nose, could that be anti-Semitism? I don't know. That's a good question. I will try to find that out, actually. Could be. Yeah, could be. Right, I mentioned the devil's mark, and I haven't explained it, but I want to. It's terrible. It's an awful thing, this. When the witch, and I say a witch with apologies to it, because they weren't witches, they were just innocent people. When they met the devil, he was meant to impart, if he touched them or kissed them, it left the devil's mark, which would be a little blemish or an insensitive spot. There could be nothing more than a mole. And what often happened was that the authorities would bring in someone who was meant to be an expert in finding witches, and in England they were called witch prickers, the famous one, Matthew Hopkins. They had it in Scotland, not quite so common, but they were called witch brothers, and it was the brother, or the bodkin, with a 3-inch needle with a wooden handle. Now, bearing in mind it was nearly always a woman, the brother would certainly be male. The person would be stripped, all of their body hair would be shaved off, and they would be examined by the brother, and he would be sticking this thing in, looking for an insensitive spot, somewhere that the woman didn't cry out or didn't bleed. It hardly bears thinking about, but and even if for some reason, who's got a perfect body, but even if the brother said, well, I can't find the devil's mark, that didn't mean the person got free, because they may say, the authorities might say, well, they're being particular, it's a very clever witch, because she's actually hid devil's mark. So even then, they might not get away. So there were several different courts in Scotland at that time, and more than one court normally would be involved in a case of witchcraft. The time between an accusation and the court case could be years, and that would be a long time, but it could be that. And it was certainly not unknown that people died in prison waiting. They died from the conditions in the prison was a torture. They could die from that, never mind any sort of physical torture. Yeah, that happened. The court case itself was normally over very quickly, just a couple of hours. There'd be a prosecutor, there'd be no defence. The woman, if I say woman, would be asked to plead guilty or innocent. And in a court of law in Scotland at that time, forget witchcraft, just generally court of law in Scotland at that time, women were generally not allowed to speak. If she was very wealthy, she could maybe employ a lawyer, assuming they were willing to take on the case, because there are examples in Edinburgh of lawyers who represented people for witchcraft, and then they got really punished financially, professionally. People didn't want to give them any work because they represented a witch, even if they got them off. So it was a difficult thing. The assize or jury would be made up of 15 men, 15. And they would obviously be landowners, etc. There would be a sheriff deputy. There'd be a clerk of the court who's a person who would have law knowledge. But it didn't all go one way. I mean, it didn't. People did get acquitted. I think their reputations were probably, their lives probably ruined afterwards. But people were acquitted, and sometimes if they were found guilty, they weren't executed. They may be banished, made an outlaw, excommunicated, but they weren't always executed, although most were if they were found guilty of witchcraft. How do we think witches were executed in Scotland?
Burn.
Burnt, yeah, burnt, yeah. Very common belief. No, they weren't. Not at all. Yeah, they weren't burnt. In Scotland, people were not burnt alive for the crime of witchcraft. They would be tied to a stake. An executioner would be brought in from outside. Very few people made any money from a witchcraft trial. The executioner and the brother were two who would do. Anyway, the person would be tied to the stake, and they would be wired at the stake. They'd be strangled. When you read the description, and sorry, it's not nice, they were technically garroted. And it was the dead body that was burnt, not the living person. It was the dead body that was burnt, and it was burnt to ash because the authorities didn't want there to be any, no body. So there was no grave. That's why you don't find graves in Scotland of people who had been convicted of witchcraft. They don't exist because there was never any body. And they didn't want a body that could come back to haunt the jury or haunt the accusers. So the dead body was burnt to ash. In England and American colonies, witchcraft was considered a felony. And if somebody was convicted of witchcraft, they were hung, because that's how felons were hung. Think of Salem, Massachusetts, 1662, whenever it was. We've all seen the plays, Arthur Miller's Crucible. They were all hung because they were following the English law that a felon would be hung. And there was no burning of bodies. The body would just be buried in unconsecrated ground. But yes, certainly in Scotland, it was not the way to execute someone. If someone was burnt alive and had been convicted of witchcraft, it was almost certainly because they'd also been convicted of treason or maybe heresy. So in the North Berwick witch trials, people were convicted, with King James VI, people were convicted of witchcraft, but they were convicted of treason for trying to kill the king. So a lot of them were burnt alive, but it was the treason verdict, not because of the witchcraft verdict. There we go. What brought it all to an end? Well, I shall tell you. Or some of the reasons. I'm sure it was massively complex. Right, what brought it all to an end? In 1736, the Witchcraft Act of what had been 1563 was repealed, and it became it was no longer legal to execute someone for witchcraft in Scotland. It was actually replaced by a sort of fraudulent Witchcraft Act. What had happened over a period of time was that the legal profession became more and more uncomfortable with the idea that in a court of law you could actually prove someone was a witch. As I was saying earlier, the age of enlightenment was beckoning more and more. People looked to science, and people, to think that in a court of law you could prove someone was a witch, they became more and more uncomfortable with that. In England, they'd been like that for a long time. The English lawyers were pretty sceptical from quite early on, which is, in England they didn't have anything like the number of executions. And they had a much larger population, of course, than in Scotland. There were cases of fraud, discovered increasing numbers of fraud amongst these witch brothers, some quite famous cases. So that sort of evidence was, you couldn't really rely on it. You couldn't rely on this. They were found to be, the thing with the brothers, they were paid per witch, so that was the thing. So, they were just like saying people were witches when, and then they got vast amounts of money, huge amounts of money. But then they were discovered to be frauds, and some of them were uncovered as frauds. And there was an increasing unease generally amongst the authorities of confessions obtained under torture. People just began to think this is not right. You can't have a confession because someone's being tortured. It's not reliable. And so that evidence started going. So the law was changed in 1736.
You're saying it's actually changed because the lawyers got a conscience?
Sorry, say that again?
The law was actually changed because the lawyers got a conscience.
I think that's probably. The question was the act changed because the lawyers got a conscience? I think some of them had a conscience. Some of them were uncomfortable for a long time. Going back generations in Scotland even. There were maybe small voices amongst many, but I think it was just a general change of attitude. People began to realise this was not right. It's perhaps unfair to say they got a conscience. I think they thought they were doing right. People thought they generally thought they were doing the right thing. The witches were evil, and they were hunting them. So that was So that was changed. After that point, it was no longer legal in Britain to execute somebody for witchcraft. So any relevance today? All of this, is it all just sort of interesting? But any relevance today is there's a lot of interest in the witchcraft trials. A lot of towns around Scotland, and Peebles was the last month in October, unveiling a monument to the people who had been executed locally for witchcraft in their town. And a lot of groups around Scotland, people are getting together and they're saying we should honour and remember these people and acknowledge the wrong done. And this has been going on for 2 or 3 years now, unveil a plaque. And Peebles did it last month, and it's sort of like snowballing as more and more towns doing this. People may have heard Nicola Sturgeon in March of this year, and she apologised on behalf of the Scottish Government for their role that they played in the persecution of people for witchcraft during that time. And then in May, the Church of Scotland apologised for its role in what happened during that time. There are a lot of universities that actually offer courses on the witchcraft trials. You can't take a degree in it, but it's part of, if you're studying history or whatever, you can actually take a course about the witchcraft trials, because it's a fascinating subject, social history, what on earth was going on. And there are quite a few students do their thesis on a very specific aspect of the witchcraft trials. I've read a few of them, and it's a great way of doing research, because they've done all the work and you can just read the thesis. Now this is interesting, and I have no particular opinion on this, but this is something that's being talked about a bit. Intergenerational trauma. Right, so your mother's been executed for witchcraft. Your life will be awful. Nobody will want to have anything to do with you. If you fall on hard times, the Kirk would not give you alms for the poor because your mother had been a witch. If they have kids, they're probably very similar. People didn't move around, memories were long, and they would have the same thing because your grandmother was a witch. If they had kids, you can see where this is going. And there are people alive that say they can trace their roots back to somebody who had been executed for witchcraft, and they say, well, there's a bit of me that's what it is because of that intergenerational trauma that's gone down generation after generation. I mean, I have no view on this, but people are talking of that. In some countries, and it actually seems to be increasing, people are still executed for witchcraft, either by the authorities or by the local community. If there's not actually a law about witchcraft, they're sometimes just executed by the community. But they can be executed by the authorities, and that seems to be a bit of a growing problem in various parts of the world. I read an article literally about 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't doing any research. It was a news item that came up, and this journalist had was writing about Ghana, writing about witch camps, which I hadn't actually come across, and it's a growing problem apparently in Ghana and it is elderly single women being accused of witchcraft, and their lives are so threatened that they've no choice but to flee the village because they've nowhere to go and nobody wants anything to do with them, and they end up in these camps. Talk amongst yourselves.
Sleep it down.
We still talk of witch hunts, don't we? Witch hunts. And the word witch is used to put down women. It's a really horrible word, but it's still used today to put down women, to shut down women. It's just an awful word to use. So what are we going to do? What are we doing now that people in 300 years' time will think, goodness, what were they thinking of? Why were they doing these things? Who knows? We're seeing it of things that happened 300 or 400 years ago. What were people going to say about us in 300 or 400 years? Anyway, I'm going to finish. I haven't got my voice back a little bit more. Finish on a more positive note, because we are nearly at the end of my talk. So the book is a new book. I know you're all wondering, when's this book out? This marvellous book, this historical fiction telling all the stuff with this stormy arc, like the Titanic. It's going to be out in April in hardback. It's called The Last Witch of Scotland, published by Black and White Publishing in Edinburgh. And it's actually, funny enough, it's been under wraps for months. It was only last week I got permission from the publisher to talk about the book. So it was only on Monday I did this talk in Tane, at the library, and that was the first time I've been allowed to talk about it publicly. It's just been under wraps for ages. But anyway, they sent out a press release, so it's out. It's public knowledge now. And there's a really nice article in the bookseller. So I printed off some copies, which Catherine has over there, my assistant at the back, and that has the information on if you want to take one about the book. And it's actually already available on Amazon, can be pre-ordered. So on that note, thank you all very much indeed.